Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending the 2022 Colin Clark Memorial Lecture. My name is Martie-Louise Vereyne, and I'm the Associate Dean Research for the Faculty of Business, Economics and Law. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of the University of Queensland, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. We know this is a particularly difficult time for many people in Southeast Queensland and the northern New South Wales affected by the recent floods. Our thoughts are with you. We will be recording this webinar for those of you unable to join us live, and we will send the recording via email to all our registrants later this week. Also joining me today in the webinar are Professor Valentin Zeleniuk, the ARC Future Fellow in the UQ School of Economics, and Professor Brenda Gannon, Director of Research in the UQ School of Economics.
Thank you, Martie-Louise, for your very nice introduction and the acknowledgement, which I also join with great respect. I believe at this time, it is also appropriate for us to take a moment to acknowledge the hardship and suffering that is now occurring in Ukraine. This is a crisis that affects us all deeply. Nations around the world, from ordinary individuals, including myself, to Nobel laureates, have united in one voice to condemn the invasion of Ukraine and demand an urgent stop of this brutal and senseless war. I'm honored and humbled that I was born and raised in Ukraine. And together with my closest family, we are fortunate to be in Australia. Yet much of our hearts and minds are with our relatives, friends, and all people currently in Ukraine. In daily conversations with my relatives in Ukraine, I hear how they stay strong while trying to survive each day and each night. How they and their kids had to hide and sleep in the cold basements these winter days so that they can increase their chances of seeing another day by avoiding the rocket attacks and bombs and extensive gunfire. 3 days ago, my younger brother went through great struggles to finally ensure his wife and their 6-year-old daughter could cross the border to save them from this nightmare. His daughter asked, "When will this war stop so that I can see you, Daddy?" "Very soon, we all hope," he said, and went back to his city to help with civil defense and humanitarian aid, especially for kids who were not able to leave. Unfortunately, there are already many victims of this war. Many lost lives, many more wounded, and millions will be traumatized for the rest of their lives. On behalf of the organizers, please join me in this moment of silence for all the victims of this war, as well as victims of all other wars and disasters attacking the humanity, lest we forget. Please also join me to stand together with the people of Ukraine, their communities here in Australia and around the world, to urge all leaders to unite to stop this brutal and senseless war and bring peace to Ukraine and to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentin. The lecture series is named in the honor of the late Dr. Colin Clark, who was a UQ economist and who worked on national income accounting and was fundamentally important to the development of macroeconomics and to the approach of John Maynard Keynes. While visiting Australia, Dr. Colin Clark accepted the invitation from the Queensland Premier, Forgan Smith, to work with government. He reflected on the opportunity in a letter to John Keynes, writing the opportunity was too remarkable an opportunity to be missed for putting economics into practice. In 1938, he was appointed government statistician, director of the Bureau of Industry, and financial advisor to the Queensland Treasury, and provided the state's first set of economic accounts in 1940. Dr. Clark's greatest contribution to economics was his pioneering role in the construction of national accounts. Each year, a leading expert in economics is invited to present the keynote address. In this year, we are very fortunate to have Professor Erik Brynjolfsson from Stanford University. I will now hand you back to Valentin to welcome and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Martie-Louise. As many of you know, Professor Erik Brynjolfsson is the Jerry Yang and Akiko Amazaki Professor and Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI and Director of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. He's the Ralph Landau Senior Fellow and at the Stanford Institute of Economic Policy Research and holds appointments at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, Stanford Department of Economics, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. One of the most cited authors on the economics of information, Professor Brynjolfsson was among the first researchers to measure productivity contributions of IT and the complementary role of organizational capital and their intangibles. He has done pioneering research on digital commerce, the long tail, bundling and pricing models, intangible assets, and the effects of IT on business strategy, productivity, and performance. Erik speaks globally and is the author of 9 books, including, with co-author Andrew McAfee, bestsellers such as The Second Machine Age, Work, Progress, and Prosperity in Time of Brilliant Technologies, and Machine Platform, Crowd, Harnessing Our Digital Future. He's also published over 100 of academic articles and holds 5 patents. He holds bachelor and master's degrees from Harvard University in Applied Mathematics and Decision Sciences, and a PhD from MIT Managerial Economics. Today, Professor Erik Brynjolfsson will be presenting on GDP-B, accounting for the value of new and free goods in the digital economy.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Valentin. And thank you also for those important words you said earlier about the tragedy in Ukraine. My heart is with you and your family and the many others who are suffering there in Ukraine. We all stand with them. Today, I feel very honored to have the opportunity to give the 2022 Colin Clark Memorial Lecture. And I very much look forward to everyone's questions and comments. It's too bad that I can't be in Australia in person today, but with the wonders of the digital economy, we can still all interact, as can people around the world. And as long as they have access to the internet, they can do it at essentially zero marginal cost. In fact, it's exactly that kind of new and free digital good and the value of it that I will be discussing today. Specifically, I'll be speaking about GDP-B, which is a new way to account for new and free digital goods in the economy. So let me just take a moment to share my slides, and I hope everyone can see my title slide there. As Valentin mentioned, I'm a professor at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, and we're doing a lot of research trying to understand better how to account for value in the economy, especially as the economy becomes more and more digital, and to address maybe one of the most basic questions that an economist can ask, which is, well, how are we doing? Are we doing well, or how are things going? Now, the usual way of addressing that is to talk about how the economy grows in terms of GDP, and whether it's the United States or Australia or other countries, That is the benchmark metric that most people rely on. It's assumed to be the way to measure living standards and how we're progressing, either through GDP and its growth or a derivative, productivity. And that has been the way we've been going about measuring our progress for decades now. But it's not necessarily the right way to measure it. In particular, Simon Kuznets, who is the father of GDP, the developer, the head of the team that developed GDP and the related national income accounts, said quite explicitly that the welfare of a nation cannot be inferred by measuring GDP or any of its derivatives. And that's because GDP is a measure of production, not well-being. GDP tells you how much you're producing, but not how much benefit you're getting from it or how much consumer surplus you're getting. And productivity, which is also often used as a measure of progress or a benchmark for living standards, is simply GDP divided by hours worked. So if we're mismeasuring GDP, then we're mismeasuring productivity by the same amount. And what I'm proposing with my team is a new set of metrics. In particular, somewhere between GDP and other macroeconomic indicators, and I think, let me see, I can maybe circle them down here, which are relatively objective and quite precise. And on the other end, you have metrics like happiness and life satisfaction, which are often measured only on a 1 to 10 scale, although perhaps get closer to what we're trying to get at, is this new metric, which I call GDP-B. And GDP-B, the B stands for benefits, seeks to measure how much value we get from the goods, not how much we're spending on them or how much we're producing, not our overall happiness. I don't think it has all the virtues of GDP or all the virtues of happiness, but it has some of the benefits of each. In particular, it's relatively precise and it gets closer to measuring well-being than some of the other metrics we've been using. Now, before I get into the details of how we're capturing this, I want to remind you all a little bit about how GDP and consumer welfare differ from each other, when they're similar, when they aren't, because I asserted up front that it's not a measure of well-being. Let's go into that in a little more depth. So compare GDP versus consumer welfare. And I'm going to consider 3 cases. The first case, and we'll just do this graphically, I think is the easiest, is classic goods. Most goods and services that in the traditional economy, the economy that Simon Kuznets looked at, that in the 1900s, things like cars and haircuts and food, had the property that when GDP went up, so did consumer surplus. And you can see this with this chart. Suppose we doubled spending on a category. So the blue rectangle grew twice as big with twice as many sales. Then to a first approximation, consumer surplus was also likely to roughly double. So you have twice as many cars or haircuts or apples. You're also getting more consumer surplus. So maybe it's not crazy to think of measuring GDP as a proxy for measuring consumer surplus. So far, so good. But we're now in an increasingly digital economy. In the 21st century, more and more goods are digital. And the average person in America spends about 6.5 hours per day consuming digital goods, staring at screens, whether they're small screens like this phone screen or medium-sized screens like the computer screen or bigger screens like televisions. That's how they consume a lot of their goods and services. And these goods and services, when they're digital, have essentially 0 marginal cost. And that means that you can consume twice as much or get twice as high quality, get more variety, more choice without having any additional expenditure. So the consumer surplus could double or more than double, even if the GDP did not change at all. And that's true for many of these different kinds of digital goods. So now GDP is not such a good proxy. It's missing the growth of the digital economy. That's pretty bad, but it gets worse. There's a third category, which I call transition goods. And these are goods that were once made of atoms, but now they're made of bits. And as you transition from atoms to bits, you actually have GDP go down even as consumer surplus go up. So suppose we spent a lot of money, like the blue area B, on on Encyclopedia Britannica or on chemical traditional photography, and now we replace it with a digital alternative like Wikipedia or digital photography, then the spending disappears and the consumer surplus grows. So we have GDP going down and consumer surplus going up. And again, more and more of the economy is in that category as well. So traditional GDP becomes an increasingly bad measure of our well-being. Now we need a new approach, and I'm going to suggest that we can understand this new approach by focusing on two aspects of the digital economy: the fact that many goods are free, like Wikipedia I just mentioned, or Facebook, or Zoom that I'm using right now, consumer search, email, many other goods and services. There are also many new goods, things that didn't exist before, like the smartphone. There are billions of smartphones now being used all around the world that have so many new goods and services, and they are a good new good and service in and of themselves. And the explosion of these new goods also are not measured well in the economy. And our new metric, GDP-B, which accounts for the benefits of new goods, seeks to capture these benefits, and it requires some new empirical techniques and also some new theoretical work. Let's look at free goods first. Hal Varian, my friend over at Google, he's the chief economist there, has said that there's a lack of appreciation for what's happening in Silicon Valley because we're not measuring what's happening in Silicon Valley. And a good example of that is the explosion of these free goods. I mentioned Zoom and Wikipedia and Skype and YouTube, Khan Academy. These are available once you have the internet, they're available for essentially zero marginal cost in addition. There's no question we have far more access to these goods and they're providing enormous service. Revealed preference shows that consumers are spending an enormous amount of time on these things, but in terms of the hours and spending more of their waking lives consuming them. So what's happening to the GDP contribution of these? Well, if you look at the information industry, and that includes magazines, television, and includes all these digital goods that I have on the left of the slide here, there's been very little, if any, change over the past 30 or 40 years. In 1983, the information industry, the information sector of the US economy accounted for about 4.7% of total GDP. Recently, it's accounted for about 4.8% of GDP. So it's almost like this entire explosion of new goods doesn't exist. It barely is a blip in the official GDP numbers. Now, that's not because information goods are not important. It's because they're not being measured properly. And of course, that's because most of them are available for zero or very low cost. Now, some of you may think, well, wait a minute, aren't these goods paid for by advertising? And it's true, some are. Wikipedia is not, Khan Academy is not, but some of the others like Facebook and Google search are paid for by advertising. Does that solve the problem? Well, no, obviously not for the ones that aren't even covered that way. But even the ones that are covered by advertising, what we see is that advertising really hasn't changed in the economy. Leonard Nakamura, Samuels, Rachel Solovich have looked at advertising going all the way back to the 1930s, and the top blue line there is the total amount of advertising revenue as a share of the economy in the United States. And it's moved around a little bit up and down, but overall, it's basically where it was or even lower than it was back in the 1930s. There have been some shifts. There's been somewhat less spending on newspapers and magazines, somewhat more spending on online and cable, but the total hasn't changed. So that doesn't really capture this explosion of new goods. There's a more fundamental problem, and that is that there's no basic relationship between advertising revenues and consumer surplus. Mike Spence and Owen in their 1977 classic paper showed that advertising really has little or nothing to do with the value that is created by the good. You could have something that creates a lot of value with low advertising revenues, or something that creates little or no value that has high advertising revenues. So we shouldn't try to use it as a proxy for the well-being or the contribution. So free goods are definitely problematic in the way we currently measure GDP. We also see that there are new goods being introduced into the economy. And here also we have a big problem. And let's take an example of the smartphone that I mentioned earlier. And just one aspect of smartphones is that they almost all incorporate cameras now, very good digital cameras. If you go back to 20 years ago, in the year 2000, 22 years ago now, there are 80 billion photos taken worldwide. Last year, there were nearly 20 times as many photos, 1.4 trillion photos taken that year. And at the same time, the price for one photo has fallen from 50 cents to, again, essentially 0 cents in marginal cost. So a huge transformation. Now, this increase in the availability of photography, I take a lot more photos now than I used to, and I suspect all of you do as well. That does not show up in our GDP anywhere. And that's because the official price index for photography, believe it or not, includes things like the price of film and developing and cameras. And all of those are essentially vanishing from our economy. Furthermore, most photos are shared in the economy. They're not sold. It's a non-monetary transaction. And again, if something has zero price, with few, if any exception, with very few exceptions, it has zero contribution to GDP. Furthermore, we're just seeing that even the cameras themselves are disappearing. There were 120 million digital cameras sold 10, 12 years ago, and now it's only 13 million a few years later. So most of the measures that you would use to try to capture photography are dematerializing, they're vanishing from our economy. It's worse than that because smartphones, as you know, are not just absorbing cameras, they're absorbing so many other goods and services. Here's an actual advertisement from Radio Shack in the early 1990s. And essentially every item for sale in this newspaper advertisement is now absorbed for free or for no additional cost into a smartphone. The camera, the alarm clock, the music player, the calculator, etc. And of course, smartphones can do far more than that. They have a much more powerful GPS map and directions, web browsers, ebook readers. I use it as a fitness monitor. There's so much more that they do that didn't even exist previously. Some people like Ray Wang have estimated that there's over $1 million worth of goods and services that are captured in our smartphones today that would have cost far more if you had bought them when they first came out 10, 20, or 30 years ago. So let's talk about how we can address this enormous gap. What we're going to do is we're going to develop a new framework for measuring welfare change. We'll derive an explicit term for what the new goods contributions are, and we'll show that welfare is mismeasured if it's not captured in our official statistics. And that will give us a lower bound on the real GDP growth that is actually happening once you consider the introduction of new goods. Then we'll also extend the theory to consider free goods. And those are goods that have zero price, but we'll show that there's a way of calculating the implicit price, what people would have been willing to pay for them. And all of this is worked out in a paper I did with Avi Collis, Erwin Dewart, Felix Eggers, and Kevin Fox, originally some years ago, now updating it. So as I said, we're going to estimate welfare directly instead of trying to infer it from changes in purchases. And we're going to use online choice experiments. There's 3 different versions of it. One called single binary discrete choice experiments, Becker-DeGroot Marshak lotteries, Bestwort scaling. I won't get into the details of those now, that won't matter because it turns out that all 3 of these, although they're quite different ways of getting at a number, they all give us essentially the same number. So that makes us somewhat confident that it doesn't matter too much how one goes about measuring it. What does matter is whether or not we do it with or without incentive compatibility. What I mean by that is that in some of our analyses, we simply ask people which they would rather have, Facebook or Wikipedia, or how much whether they would rather be willing to give up $10 or $5 for access to email. If we simply ask them, we get one set of numbers. If we enforce their choices, that is, if we say, okay, you said you'd give up Facebook for $20, we're going to give you $20 and block access to Facebook, then they sometimes give us a different number, usually a higher number when we enforce it. And so it does become important to do incentive compatibility, although the ordinal rankings tend to be essentially the same. There is some difference. And finally, it's worth noting that because we have a big digital infrastructure now, we can do many of these experiments at absolutely massive scale. We can ask questions of hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. And I'll show you data from very large experiments like that. The way we do it is through a series of different platforms. The simplest ones is we use a laboratory in a university in the Netherlands where we have a few hundred people, students, that we ask questions. The nice thing about the laboratory is we have a great deal of control over what the students have access to. We can come in, we can modify their phones and change their passwords and so forth. So we get very precise data, although of course it's more costly to work with them in that hands-on method, and it may not be as representative a sample. We also use a professional survey panel for a large number of people. This allows us to reach thousands of people. We don't have quite as much control, but we can get a good representative sample. And finally, we use Google consumer surveys to reach millions of people. And this allows for a much larger scale survey, although we can't do the incentive compatible experiments with those. And if you've probably, there's a good chance you've already interacted with Google consumer surveys. When you go online, sometimes they show you an ad. Other times they ask you to answer a few simple questions. Like for instance, here's a newspaper article in the Daily Globe. And at the bottom of it, you see this request to fill out a survey. This is one of the surveys that we were running. And we collect data from millions of users this way by having them answer questions. And we have a large number of different versions of this survey that we ask to different people. So let me show you some of the results. Let's show you first what happened with Facebook. So we did a survey where we asked users how much we would have to pay them to stop using Facebook for 1 month. And some users we offered hundreds of dollars, some we offered tens of dollars, some we offered only $1 or $2. And we got different answers. Not surprisingly, when we offered them more money, they were more likely to say yes. But not everyone said yes, even with the highest values. And not everyone said no, even with the lower values. But we did have a downward sloping demand curve. So you see that the dots here, the black and white circles over there show two different waves of the survey. The median value, the 50th percentile, was about $37 or $38 per month that we had to pay. Again, some people we had to pay more, some we had to pay less. We found that this was correlated with characteristics of the users. You won't be surprised to find that people who spent more time on Facebook in general had to be paid more to give it up. The more friends they had, the more frequently they posted, the more videos they watched, they were all more likely to require larger amounts. Interestingly, we found that on average, women required significantly higher payments than men to give up Facebook. Also, older people, I thought that was a little bit of a puzzle, but then with further research, we found that younger people had a lot of other substitutes, various social networks that I don't even know the name of, are often used by younger people as an alternative or a superior choice to Facebook. And not surprisingly, people who did spend time on some of these other media like Instagram and YouTube were less likely to need a lot of money to move away from Facebook. So it fit with, I think, your broad intuitions, at least my broad intuitions about what might be going on. In general, we found that every time we looked at different goods and services, they generated fairly plausible demand curves. And it didn't matter which of the different techniques we used, whether it's Becker group Marshak lotteries, the best worst scaling, or the single binary discrete choice experiment. They all gave essentially the same values. As I mentioned earlier, doing it with incentive compatibility tended to lead to higher evaluations. We consistently found a ranking that search was the most valuable digital good, then email, maps, video, all the way down to messaging and music, which were still quite valuable, but not as valuable as those earlier ones. The consumer surplus from Facebook was typically on the order of $450 for the median consumer. And what we found was we could scale this up fairly easily to have lots of goods and services. So let me just show you a few of those to give you a little bit of a sense for what we could see. For instance, here's Wikipedia, the median value, the 50th percentile there intersects at about $150 per year that you would have to pay to give someone to give up Wikipedia. As you can imagine, that's quite a bit of value overall in the economy. Email, search, maps, videos, e-commerce, social media, messaging, music, they all had these downward sloping demand curves with different median valuations. And you can see that this methodology allows us to calculate consumer surplus from all of these different goods and services. We also could do it for non-digital goods, and we had some fun looking at goods and services, some of which my friend Bob Gordon had suggested, like indoor plumbing and toilets. We looked at what happened if you took away televisions or search engines, online maps, music streaming, breakfast cereal, in homage to Jerry Hausman, who had looked at that. Airline travel was less than I expected it to be. Public transportation, ride-sharing services. We got a fairly consistent ranking. We also put some dollar values in there. The black bars are dollars, so that allows us to calibrate a bit. Toilets are the most valuable thing that we asked about. At the other end were access to Uber or WhatsApp. There were less than $1 for most people, but they all had these different values. And now we're beginning to see that you can capture a sense of what kinds of goods and services are more valuable, which are less valuable, completely independently of what people are spending on them. Some of the very valuable goods people spend zero on, and some of the less valuable goods have a significant contribution to GDP. Now we can in turn calculate how this contributes to overall welfare change as a percentage of the economy. And what we'll do is we'll look at what happens when you have a good, call it Z star star, that has a certain amount of utility. And we calculate a global willingness to accept function, which is what happens when you take that good away. And so you basically have this WTA function when you compare the consumption expenditure needed with the good versus without the good to have the same total utility. And that will tell us how much value that item is providing in order to get you back to the same total utility. And the total income then, or what we call the total income approach, is how much total income a person would have to be compensated with to be at the same level of utility as when they didn't have that good. So this is a theory we worked out in the paper. Kevin Fox and Erwin Dewart in particular did a lot of analysis on this. And the nice thing, it maps very directly into those empirical estimates I showed earlier. And you can simply calculate a ratio, T1 over T0, which is the ratio of how much more total income one has with the free goods versus without the free goods. And then you deflate that by the GDP deflator, although technically there's a slightly different deflation that makes a small rounding error adjustment to that we work out in the paper. So how much value are these goods creating? Well, let's look at one of them, which is Facebook. And what we found was that Facebook, the existence of Facebook, added about 2/3% of additional GDP growth, 0.68%. Now that was from the beginning of time, from when Facebook was first invented to 2017, when we did the analysis. 2/3%, if you spread that evenly over those previous 14 years, it works out to be about 0.05% per year, or in other words, GDP growth would be 1.87 with Facebook, or only 1.83 without Facebook. So not a huge difference, but if you think about it, if you had 20 or 30 such goods, it would roughly double the amount of GDP growth in the economy. And this is just one good, Facebook. You could look at some of the new goods being introduced, like the smartphone camera I mentioned earlier. And the way we did that was we asked people to how much whether they'd be willing to give up use of the smartphone camera in exchange for some money. And if they said yes, we disabled it with this tape that couldn't be forged. And so some people we would have to pay them to give it up. We found the numbers were actually quite large. This is in the laboratory, so this may not be a representative sample, but these are students at a Dutch university. We actually had to pay them on average about $68 to get them to give up this smartphone camera for a month. That works out to $2 to $3 per day to not be able to take photos with their camera. Interestingly, you could buy a smartphone camera for about $70. So of course it wouldn't be integrated with your camera. So it gives you a sense of an enormous valuation these students were putting on it. The implied contribution, if they were representative of the economy, was about 0.62% of additional GDP growth per year. So these smartphone innovations are enormously valuable, far more valuable than Facebook, but each of them is actually quite a large number. So before I turn to your questions and comments, let me just put this in context a little bit. As I mentioned, GDP-B falls between these well-being metrics and the macroeconomic indicators. I think it has the benefit that it's closer to the objectivity of GDP. GDP may be measurable to 8 or 9 or even 10 significant digits. GDP-B isn't quite as precise as that, but it's still quite precise. We can get it fairly accurately. But more importantly, it is much closer to measuring well-being and what we're really trying to get after. GDP is a very precise number, but it's precisely the wrong number if you want to understand consumer surplus or well-being. So we need to get at these other metrics like well-being or GDP-B to understand better. And we have a series of papers where we work this out in more detail. So looking forward to your questions, but let me just conclude by summarizing that GDP, which was developed back in the 1930s by Simon Kuznets, remains the de facto metric of economic growth. It's what every news media, every economist, every politician tends to refer to when they're asking how well we're doing. But conceptually, it's actually not the correct measure. And so we've been using, in some ways, the wrong measure of our well-being. I think any economist would agree that consumer surplus, or maybe the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus, would be a much better metric of well-being. And that's especially important for digital goods that have zero price. Historically, we haven't had a way to measure those and sum them up, but we can look at the changes in consumer surplus by doing these massive online choice experiments, and they will supplement other measures of economic welfare like GDP or happiness metrics. And in particular, GDP-B is out there to measure the benefits, not just the production costs of goods. And we're expecting that over time, we'll have a dashboard, a broad set of these metrics that we can get at to see which parts of the economy are creating more benefits and less benefits compared to what we thought. You can read about it in some of these papers that we've written together, or appropriately, there are these free website where you can go and download the information and the tables and the further analysis. This is my laboratory, the Digital Economy Lab. This is a site where we measuring the economy, where we have a lot of papers on this topic. And this is my personal website where I've got papers on this as well as a number of other topics. And let me just say a closing word about Simon Kuznets, the father of GDP. It turns out that he did his studies at Kharkiv National University. And if you recognize that name, Kharkiv National University, in fact, they now call it the Simon Kuznets School of Economics at Kharkiv National University. That's because it's been in the news lately. Here's a photo from 2018, which sadly is an out-of-date photo of the university. As of today, this is what the university looks like because of the state of emergency in Ukraine. So I just wanted to echo what Valentin said a little bit earlier, that these are trying times. And I know we're all thinking about not just how we can measure GDP better, but how we can help our friends in Ukraine who are under attack right now. Thanks very much. Looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Erik, for the great presentation. And also from me personally, thank you for pointing out the legacy connection of legacy of Simon Kuznets to Ukraine, to Kharkiv, and showing these pictures, which are horrific.
Yeah, it was quite shocking when I saw those pictures it's literally from today. That photo right. I showed with the flames. Yeah,
that's right. I read exactly those news as well today. Thank you. We'll try to move on. I would like to remind that you can put the questions. I see we have already a lot, but we're also a little bit ahead of time. Thank you, Erik, for giving us more time for questions.
Yeah, well, I love the Q&A. I love the interaction. I'm hoping I can learn a little bit from you all. Thank you. During this discussion.
Thank you. I give the floor to Professor Brenda Gannon, who will facilitate the first questions and as well as some other questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Valentin, and thanks for a very insightful talk. There are a number of questions, as Valentin has alluded to, Perhaps I could start off by just asking a question myself. This is a really interesting concept and a really interesting way to measure the GDP-B. But how would it work across countries then? There will be some subjective responses in there in the willingness to pay or willingness to accept. And how, could you comment on that, please?
Sure. Well, it's meant to be more objective than simple happiness measures. So I'm a fan of these happiness measures, which, you know, often say on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you? I think one of the difficulties there is that the word happy has different synonyms. You know, in Denmark, maybe it's closer to satisfied, and maybe in another country, it's closer to, you know, ecstatic. And so you may not be asking the exact same concept. With GDP-B, what we try to do is normalize that by providing dollar amounts or cash amounts. Now, you can ask whether or not the exchange rate in those dollars or purchasing power parity is correct. But just as GDP might not be exactly comparable, it has the exact same strengths and weaknesses when you convert to GDP-B, because what we're saying is how much compensation would we have to give you to say, you give up Wikipedia? Would you take this amount of money? You can also do it relative. We did find, we've just begun doing it in different countries, and we did find in most cases the values were very similar across different goods. That ranking, one that was remarkably different, I was surprised, I thought we had made a mistake, was WhatsApp. In the United States, WhatsApp had a pretty low valuation. You may have seen that I remember that from the chart. Over in the Netherlands, WhatsApp had an enormously high valuation. And I told my team, you've made some kind of mistake. How can it be worth so much? But then we went and interviewed the people, and the students who were using WhatsApp in the Netherlands said that they essentially couldn't live without it, that was how they kept in touch with all of their friends. That's how they got jobs, that's how they contacted their babysitter. That's how they talked to their dates. And so if you took away WhatsApp, they would be socially isolated. So that was a situation where there was a very different valuation, but it reflected a real difference in how they used it. Another point about that particular one is that it highlights that these goods can have different values depending on the context. The features were the same in both countries, but the network effects were very different in those different places.
Thank you. And I'll hand you back now for the next question.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Ghana. Thank you, Brenda. Next question is from a colleague from University of Sydney, maybe a little bit technical, but I guess would be interesting. The question is, why was WTA metric was chosen over WTP metric for the Facebook survey? And wouldn't WTP be expected to give much smaller value?
Yeah, so there's two concepts there. There are people in behavioral economics who have found that in many cases, so in theory, they should give you the same value if you're an economist. In practice, they don't give you the same value. And behavioral economists have pointed out that part of this has to do with the endowment effect, and there are different phenomena there. So people sometimes have different valuations. In our case, there's an additional complication, which is that it was very hard for us to control access to the good. People can access these goods very easily externally. And so they're used to paying zero for it and just getting it for free. So their willingness to pay for something that they already have is often going to be close to zero. It's not a real experiment. We need to have a way to take it away from them and see what that value is. So in that case, we thought willingness to accept was going to be closer to what the value of the good was. If we said willingness to pay for something that they already have, easy access to, it would be hard for them to say, why should I pay anything?
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you. And actually, I think that answers a few questions that have arisen here on the same concept. So moving on to the next question from John Quigg in UQ. Diminishing marginal utility is a problem here. For example, water contributes only a small amount to GDP, but WTA to do without it would be infinite. Should we be at WTA for marginal reductions in access to the internet?
Yes. Yeah, so this is an important point. And at first I thought it was a bug. I've now decided that it's a feature, that it's a good feature, that we can ask these questions in lots of different ways. and get at, I think we generally want to focus on the marginal contribution, not the absolute contribution. So taking away all water from somebody, of course, is catastrophic, but having different quality of water, is the water, does it have lead in it? Is it dirty? Or is the water you get from your tap now as reliable as it was a year ago or 5 years ago? Those deltas are something that we care about more, and they get at it. Also, when you aggregate different combinations of goods together, the value for one soda may not be very much, but if you take away all kinds of sodas or all kinds of soft drinks, the value might be greater. And our methodology allows us to ask at these many different levels of aggregation what the value is. And from an economist's perspective, I'm very excited that it gets us to, we can understand the marginal and the substitution. So for instance, I didn't report it in the talk, we looked at different timescales. What if you lost access to Facebook for 1 day, for 1 week, for 1 month, for 2 months, for 12 months? And it's not the case that it's a linear increase. It actually turns out to be a bit of an S curve. Taking away Facebook for small amounts of time doesn't seem to cost very much. Then it gets more costly for about a month or so. That is the highest rate. But if you take it away for a very long time, I think people feel like, okay, now I'm going to develop alternative ways of connecting with my friends. So you start being able to understand these interactions and substitution levels across goods and within goods in a way that traditional GDP doesn't say anything about. It just gives you one particular point. Our methodology gives you a much richer set of metrics about the valuations.
Thank you very much, Erik. I have another question. I will combine a few and also will add a little bit from myself. In measuring the normal GDP, there were already for a long time a lot of criticism that it is not accounting the so-called undesirable outputs, the bad outputs, that
Yes.
are things, the pollution that is produced when we produce good outputs like energy or steel and so on.
Right.
The question is, here we know that there is in production and all the social networks, there is a lot of what many people say addiction, especially for kids. They spend
Yes.
too much time, even if in reasonable quantities some information could be good. They get addicted and watch too much and waste time maybe that they could have used for more productive activities, for learning, maybe other
Right.
things like math and literature and so on. Moreover, there is also a lot of bad information there on the internet. So should this be measured also? And is that easy? I'm sure you've thought of this. Maybe you can.
I have thought of it.
Give some insights.
And other of my colleagues have thought about it more carefully than I have. So in particular, Hunt Alcott and Matt Jenskow have a paper where they dive much more deeply into the idea of digital addiction and specifically Facebook. I was flattered that they used the same methodology as we did, and they came up with almost the same values as we did. So I felt some robustness. They're very good economists. We took a relatively agnostic view, like a beginning economist student might say that, like, if somebody likes chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream, it's not my job to say, no, chocolate isn't as good as vanilla. Or if they like Facebook versus television, or if they like playing sports versus, whatever. So we were agnostic and just said the value that people put on it is the value they put on it. And I think that's a good starting point. And that's what you learn in the first part of the economics textbook. But if you think more deeply, as you have, and as Matt Jenskow and others have done, you realize that, okay, maybe there is such a thing as addiction. I guess you go back to Gary Becker, who first did some research on that. And it may be that people's expressed preferences don't reflect their real preferences. There could be sort of a system 1 versus system 2 conflict going on in their brains, the way Danny Kahneman describes it. And what they found was, indeed, there is evidence of digital addiction, that people would pay a lot to continue to use the product, like Facebook. But then if they were brought away from it for a month or two and given the opportunity to start again, they would say, no, actually, I don't want to do it again. I prefer to be off of it. And that's, I think, evidence of this kind of digital addiction. So a more sophisticated analysis would maybe allow for sort of a short-term system one, you're thinking fast, instinctive choices versus your long-term, more considered choices, and they may be different. Two parts of your brain may be in conflict with each other. We didn't do it in our analysis, but I can imagine people extending what we're doing the way Matt and Hunt did to understand more this concept of digital addiction. You also asked about pollution. This is a place I think there's a relative strength in what we do, is that I did it quickly. I did show in that thing, we asked different things like about what would happen if you didn't have access to your friends for 1 year, or we can ask about water pollution, air pollution. So we can ask about a bunch of things that aren't in the market economy. We're actually doing some now on household production, about home care. These are things that we can ask about using our methodology that are difficult, if not impossible, to do through traditional GDP. So it broadly expands the set of goods and services that we can keep track of, or bads and services, things that are negative and positive. And my agenda, and I just had a meeting this morning with my team, is to include not only the market goods and services, and not only the digital goods and services, but also some of the non-market goods and services like household production, pollution, healthcare, social stuff. And ultimately, we get a broader set of where our well-being comes from. I think a moment's introspection makes us all realize that a big percentage, perhaps a majority of the utility we get in our lives doesn't just come from the things that we buy and sell.
Thank you, Erik. I turn the floor back to Brenda.
And we have a great comment here from Paul McCarthy saying a great talk, and this is especially relevant for the Colin Clark lecture, given his role in the development of national accounts. So thank you. So moving on to the next question by Claire McFarland. So she said, one risk is the current way of measuring prosperity by GDP is that policymakers often overlook the importance of digital goods and services in the economy, and therefore overlook the importance of getting regulatory settings right. So what kind of changes are you seeing within the policy sphere in relation to this work?
Well, that's a great question. And let me touch on three aspects of it. First, on the positive side, there's so much value created by some of these digital goods like Zoom we're doing right now that doesn't show up in GDP. And, they all say you can't manage what you don't measure. So if our legislature, if our executive branch, if our judicial branch doesn't see the value that's being created by certain types of technologies or digital goods, they may assume that that value is zero and make some bad choices about, say, over-investing in, cars or coal, and not investing in remote work or digital learning. So that's one possibility. We just get a better sense of where value is actually coming in the economy. And of course, it's increasingly from the digital sphere. A second thing is you can use it for antitrust policy. On Monday, I had a PhD student from Columbia presenting at my group named Guy Aridor, doing some fabulous work looking at what happened when he used methodology similar to what I did, building on it. What happens when you take away one good or two goods or three goods together, and from that you can learn the substitution elasticities. For instance, if you take away Facebook, do people spend more time on Instagram? If you take away Facebook and Instagram together, how much substitution is there to YouTube versus maybe something offline? And by doing this, you can start seeing which goods are actual in the same market or different markets. And if you're an antitrust regulator, you need to know this information. Historically, they've been using some very crude metrics, like they say, oh, that's an entertainment product and that's a productivity product. But the real question is how much people substitute from one to the other. And that's an empirical question that we can solve with this kind of methodology. And finally, going back to Valentin's earlier point, another policy use is just to understand where there's some goods and bads, pollution, addiction, other things, you can get at all those things as well. But ultimately, the high level point is that we won't manage what we don't measure. And to me, this is the right way of measuring where value is coming from. And once we have that right, we can answer a lot of other questions about how we allocate our resources or our antitrust or our legislation and regulation in a more thoughtful way than we otherwise would.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. Next question. Again, I will try to combine a few. Your research indicates that productivity benefits from digital goods will be captured with GDP-B. Does this resolve the productivity paradox with the apparent failure of digital services to increase productivity growth? I guess that's the famous.
I love that question because it was a big motivation for why I did this. As many of you know, I'm a fan of technology. I talk about it all the time, but I've also been very disappointed that productivity growth in the United States, in Australia, in 19 out of 20 OECD countries, instead of accelerating, has actually decelerated. So in the US, it grew about 2.8% in the 90s and early 2000s, and it's the past decade or so, it's slowed to about 1.3%. So that's a mystery. And my first instinct was, well, that's a measurement problem. And there are many people who say, well, that's because we're not capturing all this benefit. And I would say, yes, it's true that we are missing a lot of the measures. And for a while, I was convinced by my own story. And then I talked to Chad Severson and Bob Gordon, and they have convinced me that it's not just measurement. And the reason it's not just measurement is that while we're missing a lot today, we were also missing a lot in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, you know, penicillin, television. There were many other innovations back then that also were not measured. So we have big unmeasured amounts today, big unmeasured amounts previously. Which one is bigger? It's not obvious. My instinct says it's gotten bigger over time, but I can't say that for sure unless we went back in time and measured the consumer surplus from, say, penicillin. So it's not just measurement. I think part of it is that story. My view is that probably the bigger part of it is what I call the productivity J curve, which is this idea that when you implement a powerful new technology like artificial intelligence, you need to reinvent your business processes. You create a lot of intangible assets. These intangible assets are costly to create, but like free goods, they don't show up in GDP. So we have another kind of mismeasurement problem, which is the investment in intangibles. And as a result, initially measured productivity goes down, but then when you start harvesting those intangibles, productivity should go up. So I have a paper, as I mentioned, called the productivity J curve that works this out in a little bit more detail. It's a different kind of mismeasurement, but I don't think that what I showed you today by itself is sufficient to explain the productivity slowdown.
Thank you very much, Erik. I'm sure everybody will join me to saying that we would all love to continue learning from you through your lecture and through this wonderful discussion. However, I see that time is up. I'm passing the floor to Professor Brenda Gannon to give the concluding remarks as the Director of Research of our school. Thank you.
Thank you again. And as Director of Research in the School of Economics, and on behalf of the School of Economics and the Faculty of Business Economics and Law, I'd really like to thank you, today's speaker, Professor Brynjolfsson, for this wonderful talk, and also to the organizers who were involved in creating this event. Much work has gone in the past few weeks on this. And to all of the attendees today as well for the wonderful participation and questions, and of course to the Colin Clark family as well. So please join me in this virtual round of applause if at all possible. I know you're thinking of us. And what we'd like to wish you all well, and particularly during all of these challenging times. So thank you and good to have a great afternoon. Goodbye.